Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific. I'm Jerry Schubel, president of the Aquarium, and it's great to have all of you with us this evening. We wish you could be here in person, but having you virtually is probably the best alternative for now. I want to thank our lecture sponsors, Gazette newspapers, and the Courtyard Marriott, without whose support this lecture series would not be possible. Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor John Sabo from Arizona State University, who is going to discuss food security on the Mekong River. This is a very important story because tens of millions of people depend upon this river for their food supply, and the food supply is threatened by a number of actions in a number of countries that border this important river. Professor Sabo is professor of river ecology and water resources in the School of Life Sciences, and he is the founding director of Future H2O in the Office of Knowledge Enterprise Development at Arizona State University. He's also senior sustainability scientist in the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. He's a fellow in the Institute for the Future of Innovation in Society, and he's an honors faculty member in the Barrett Honors College, and he serves on the graduate faculty in the Hydrosystems Engineering graduate program. He's got lots of appointments there at Arizona State University. He received his BS from Notre Dame, his master's from the University of Washington in fishery science, and his PhD in ecology from Cal Berkeley. It's my pleasure to welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific, Professor John Sabo. John?
Well, thank you so much, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be giving this lecture in spite of the circumstances. But as you say, it's an important story, and the work goes on in spite of the pandemic. So I'm happy to be talking about it here. So today I'm going to talk to you about how engineering can help hopefully improve both the ecological function and the food security in a big basin that's undergoing really significant and rapid hydropower development and other forms of development, and that's in the Mekong Basin in Southeast Asia. Before I start, I have a few acknowledgments. I want to acknowledge first the Mekong River Commission, who's been a very strong partner for us in our work, in particular in providing data, context, and collaborative support within the basin region. So they're our very important partner in the region. I also want to thank two colleagues who really helped me pull off this work. This work was a large effort and is ongoing. But Gordon Holgreave really introduced me to the basin and to context in the MRC and really got me grounded in the basin. So I thank Gordon for that and for his ongoing support and collaboration from the University of Washington. And second, Albert Ruhi, who was a postdoc in my lab when we did a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today, is now a professor at UC Berkeley. I just wanted to acknowledge him because without Albert, we wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the fisheries modeling that I'll talk about later in this segment. Okay, so with those acknowledgements done, I'd like to move on and just kind of paint a picture, give you kind of a roadmap for the talk. First, I'm going to give you an introduction to the Mekong River and its fishery. We'll talk then about impending changes to the flood pulse cycle in the Mekong River, which is really important for the fishery and for rice production in the basin. It's also the reason why people are eyeing the river for hydropower development. Then we'll talk about some science. I'll describe a method for quantifying change in hydrology, in particular in the variability of the hydrology. We'll talk about that new method in the context of how flood pulse fisheries have been analyzed and managed in the past. I'll give you some picture of century scale changes in hydrology in the Mekong with dams in the center stage in that story. And finally, I'll use some new methods to analyze fisheries with that hydrology in it to look to see, A, if there are significant drivers of fishery production and that are hydrologic in nature, and B, if we can use those hydrologic drivers to forecast the fishery and maybe to design better management scenarios in the future, given that dams are coming online. Seems like every year a new one almost. Okay, so first, the Mekong River fact sheet. The river is a big basin. It's almost 800,000 square kilometers. It's in 6 countries: China, Laos, the PDR, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam. It's the 5th largest river by discharge at the monsoon flood pulse. It's not as big when it's at base flood, but during the flood pulse, it's the 5th largest river in the world. It has more than 800 species of fish in the basin, which I think is incredible. But even more incredible is that there are equally impressive numbers of snakes, turtles, and frogs. And almost all of these species and all of these groups factor into food security in one way or another in Cambodia in particular, but across the basin. The human population in the basin is 70 million. That's equivalent to Colorado Basin for context. However, if you put China in there, between 50 and 76% of the population is rural in the basin. 76 being the number for Cambodia, which is in the top 10 of most rural countries in the world. And as a result, the captured fisheries from the river, so freshwater capture, provides more than 50% of the animal protein and vitamin A for this population of more than 50 million, almost 70 million people. In addition, rice exports, particularly from Thailand and Vietnam, are the largest in the world when you combine those 2 countries' exports. So they're growing and shipping rice out to other countries, notably China and India. And then last but not least, China is upstream. And I'm going to come back to many of these points later in the talk after we get into the science. Okay, so that's the fact sheet for the Mekong. It should give you a background. Now let's talk about the Tonle Sap. The Tonle Sap Lake and river system is in central Cambodia. It's a tributary system to the lower Mekong. And if you look in this inset here, it joins with Mekong right at Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. It's a really interesting river. And I learned about it first from Pierce's book, When Rivers Run Dry. The Mekong during base flow flows into the delta and into the ocean via Vietnam and the Vietnam Delta. And the lake drains through that course. But during the flood pulse, there's so much water in the lower Mekong coming down that it actually forces the Tonle Sap River to flow upstream, and it fills this dark blue base flow lake to a lake that's the size of the state of Rhode Island, which is in light blue outline here. And that flood pulse and that new wetland, larger lake system that's created by the flood pulse and the reverse flow of the Tonle Sap River provides nursing habitat for a great number of fishes, both resident and migratory in the system, and enormous production of fisheries and of rice in the system. So flood pulse is crucial to that food system. And much of the work that we're going to talk about analyzes a fishery called the Dai fishery, which is a bagnet fishery on the Tonle Sap River that captures fish going out of the Tonle Sap from that nursery system back into the main stem Mekong to habitats either upstream or downstream. Okay, just some pictures to give you context about life in the Tonle Sap. I've spent some time on the lake in villages. This is Akol village on the left, from the field house of Conservation International, who is also been a strong partner for us in this work. And these are some pictures of people in Akol. This is a village of about 100 households. These households are floating on the lake, and most people in these households rely on the lake for food. They grow vegetables in sort of floating gardens on the back of their houses. They grow rice, they harvest fish directly from the river, and they trade that in a local economy. And the lake is also very much an open latrine. So you see kids playing in this water, and the playground is both the playground for food capture and harvest, and also for sewage. Okay, that was Akol, 100 households. There are larger floating villages that have thousands of people. This is just a picture of a Vietnamese merchant in the Tonle Sap, probably going to get a cell phone charged on a car battery or do some other kind of business transaction that's possible in this context. And then finally, the fish. The fish are super important, not just for subsistence, which is in this picture here. This is a subsistence fisher capturing small fish, probably for dinner and for sale in a local nearby village. This was very close to Ecol, but also harvest of bigger fishes, including kana, which are called snakeheads in the U.S. and are invasive in the U.S. are actually a high value fish that might be captured on Tonle Sap and traded inland to cities and maybe abroad as well to other countries in Southeast Asia. Okay, that's an introduction to the Mekong and its fishery in the Tonle Sap, which will give us context for the analysis that I'll be talking about. Now I want to talk about impending changes to the flood pulse and its fishery so that we can, again, have that context before getting into the science. Okay, when I embarked on this work with the Mekong River Commission, the idea was to look at climate change and how climate change and change in the monsoon in particular, which drives the flood pulse, would affect the fishery. And some of the key insights that we know, maybe with not tons of skill yet, but we have a good feeling for are these two. Within a year, there's a projected earlier arrival of monsoon, and that timing may have impacts on the fishery. Among years, more importantly, there's an ongoing increase in variability between wet and dry years. And this is especially true over the last decade or 2 decades. And I'm going to return to that point later, but I want to say that very early on in our work with the MRC, we pivoted from climate change towards development of hydropower as a driver of the fishery and did most of our work on hydropower. But in the last piece of our analysis, we really had to come back to climate change. And so I wanted to put this in here and tell you that we'll come back to that later. Okay, this is the story from the development of hydropower and storage on the Mekong. These data are from the MRC. They were handed to me a long time ago, probably 2012 when I first started working with the MRC. And since then, a lot has happened, but the story is still pretty much the same. Prior to 1985, there were 18 dams in the system. The first one was built in 1964 in Thailand on the U River headwaters. During the period 1985 to 2007, there were 18 dams built. Most of these were on tributaries. Some of them had pretty massive storage, especially in Lao PDR, and that'll be relevant in the talk later. Since this timeline has ended in 2007, there have been 11 new mainstream dams closed, and numerous tributary dams, especially in the lower river in Cambodia, in the Cambodia, Vietnam, Lao 3S system, which I'll also talk about later. Okay, so lots of dam building and lots of concern about the impacts of those dams on the fishery, because a large number of, especially the commercially important fish that get exported and the charismatic megafauna in the system, the big catfish and carp, migrate long distances in the Mekong, and the dams create discontinuities along that migratory pathway. And we'll return to that at the very end of the talk. So here's a system level view of the Mekong, the lower Mekong, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. It's a food, energy, water system, and we are studying it in that context, both with funding from the National Science Foundation and from U.S. Department of State. And the basic idea is that in the monsoon season, lots of rain falls in the highlands of Laos and Vietnam, and that rain causes this flood pulse, which enlarges the Tonle Sap Lake, creates a vital fishery for the region there, and also provides critical water resources to the delta where there's enormous rice production. So that's basically the food, energy, water system there. The energy piece comes in here, and it's from hydropower. There's at least 40 gigawatts of potential, probably more if we start thinking about the 11 main stem dams that have been built in China. And so, the possibility for this river bringing, accelerating the development trajectory and bringing the rural poor out of poverty in some of these regions is enormous. And that is counterbalanced with the food system, which is vital for that rural population right now. So I think these are the issues that we're trying to grapple with in this research. Okay, so the focus is again going to be on inland capture fisheries. Here's some pictures from that. And on the Tonle Sap River, there are these bagnet fishery. There's a bagnet fishery which is called the dye, and a dye is basically a live aboard bagnet. There's a house on the river. I'm taking a picture from that house, and each house has a bagnet that it collects fish from 24/7 for greater part of 3 to 4 months a year, maybe 5 months during the flood pulse. So enormous capture, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Here are the questions that we were asked to address by the MRC. First, can we use hydrology to forecast and manage the fishery? Second, how will dams and climate change affect the flood pulse, with a focus more on dams in this talk? And then finally, how are changes in the flood pulse going to affect the fishery? We took this a step further, which I'll discuss later, which is to actually try to engineer a better management scenario for the system, such that you're managing outflows from the hydropower facilities in order to increase fishery production. Okay, now we're going to pivot into some science. And so the first piece of this is really looking at how one would quantify hydrology, changes in hydrology, and how one would use that indices from that hydrologic analysis to assess what's happening with the fishery and what might happen with the fishery under different hydropower scenarios. And so this is a paper written by a group of prominent hydrologists about stationarity. And the message is that stationarity is dead. We can't assume that conditions stay the same anymore. We have to think about the long-term trajectories, both as in terms of cycles and trends. And so with that in mind, we sought to create a method using well-known time series tools to assess hydrologic change and to look at change in the context of construction of dams in the basin. And to do this, we use the discrete fast Fourier transform, the DFFT, I'm going to call it. It's a spectral method, and I have some slides later that talk about spectral fisheries analysis. So the spectral piece is really in the hydrology. This is a time series method that's pretty data hungry, but there are lots of really good data provided by the MRC in the Mekong Basin for hydrology. In fact, there are gauge data, daily hydrologic data dating back over a century in several sites, and those data collection methods and the data sets themselves survived amazing upheaval in the region, including the Khmer Rouge and Vietnam War and things like that. So it's impressive that we have those data sets and that we can use them. But basically, DFFT allows us to quantify first the trend and remove that trend, and then look at periodics in the time series, the most important of which is annual seasonality driven by the flood pulse. And then we can also look at departures from that seasonality or extremes, which are these red dots. And those are going to be important features that we're going to use to fingerprint different kinds of hydrologic regimes and change in those regimes. Okay, so the periodics, for those of you that follow ecology or phenology, and the departures, we're going to call anomalies. So they're anomalous flows, and we're going to use the anomalies rigorously in the next set of slides. Okay, DFFT, for those of you that have a little bit of engineering background, it's not a statistical method that relies on best fit. It's analytical. It takes a noisy signal like this one and decomposes it into a family of periodics that are more easily to interpret, and allows us to kind of separate noise and signal and understand what are expected signals and what's more random, and to quantify that random variability. And that randomness is actually what we're after and what we're interested in connecting to the fishery more than the seasonality. Okay, so Again, just to reinforce this, the difference between the observation and what's expected from the seasonal trend from the DFFT is what's called an anomaly. This would be a negative anomaly, and this would be a positive anomaly. And that turns out to be a pretty powerful way to look at variability in the system, because it allows us not only to get that magnitude of variability, but also magnitude with reference to the seasonal trend and therefore timing. Okay, some examples. So this is 100 years of data at Stung Treng, which is one of the first gauges on the Mekong in Cambodia. And as you can see, there's 100 years of data, 102 years of data here that continue to collect these data. These are daily average discharge measurements. And in a traditional hydrologic analysis, one would look at the annual max and mins and use those to quantify recurrence intervals of certain events and use the recurrence intervals then to do some ecological analysis. We were not interested in those absolute events. We were more interested in timing, because we think that the timing of the flood pulse is super critical to the fishery. And so the DFFT approach, the spectral approach, really allowed us to look at anomalies from a different perspective. So these blue triangles are positive anomalies that are significantly different than the rest. They're 2 standard deviations above the mean, and the pink ones are negative anomalies. And basically the positive anomalies give us some idea of early onset and late recession of the flood pulse, and the negative anomalies give us some idea of late onset of the flood pulse or of low snowpack coming from China. So they really give us some nice clues about what's happening hydrologically. Okay, so I've made it now through the first 3 sections. We're going to talk now a little bit about, before diving into data and the actual scientific analysis, we're going to talk a little bit about how traditionally the fishery has been analyzed at the Mekong, and also in general for flood pulse fisheries, which are common in 4 continents, I think 5 continents, and super common in Asia, Africa, and South America, and the Amazon, and other places in South America and Central America. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. So most of what we know about flood pulse fisheries comes from this book, which was published in 1979 by Robin Malcolm. And the crux for this talk from this book is that the magnitude of the flood pulse, so if this is discharge or stream flow on the y-axis and month on the x-axis, the magnitude of the flood pulse can be measured as a product of its max magnitude, which would be the difference between bankful width and the peak flow volume, and the time at which we're above bankful width. So if we integrated under that curve, that area would give us a metric that we could then compare to the fish catch in the river. And that's how flood fisheries ecology has been done in the past. This is flood pulse extent, it's called, which is magnitude times duration. And it's been a very useful tool, and still we use it in this analysis, but bolster it with some spectral methods that really allow us to think about variability in the system and how a manager or dam operator might view variability productively, such that the fishery is managed simultaneously with power production. Okay, so now we're going to pivot again and talk a little bit about spectral measures of the flood pulse. These are the measurements that we're going to tie to the fishery later, in addition to using flood pulse extent. And so there are a couple of metrics I want to point out here. First, I'll just tell you that this is the DFFT trends. This is seasonality or phenology. This is a detrended time series. So we've taken out the linear trend, and now we're looking at the seasonal signal here in light sort of greenish blue. And then the dots are in a cartoon format, daily observations. And what I want to show is that there are kind of 3 metrics that we're interested in. The first is what's called the interflood interval. Is the net annual anomaly. And the net annual anomaly is basically if we take all of these dots, which are daily observations, And we look at the difference between that and what's expected from the seasonal signal. We get a bunch of negatives down here, and we get a bunch of positives up here, some more positives here, some more negatives here. If we add all those up, that gives us what we call NAA, which is net annual anomaly. It's the net sum of all of the anomalies across the year. And so when it's negative, it means it's a dry year, and when it's positive, it means it's a wet year. And we're going to use NAA in combination with flood pulse extent to look at the fishery. But we're also going to look at a couple of other key metrics. The first is the length of this low flow period here. So if the flood pulse is important, we wanted to also look at drought, see if drought was important, either as a negative or positive driver in fishery. And so the number of days that this pink interval lasts, the longest one is called the interflood interval. We're going to use that. That's number 6 right here. We're going to use the maximum magnitude of high flow anomalies, which is this triangle, blue triangle up here. It's the biggest one. And we're also going to look for the number of peaks that we see in the flood pulse, the number of independent peaks. We're going to look at many other variables, but those 3 that I just mentioned are the most important, so I wanted to point them out in this context. Okay, so this leads us to some new hypotheses. The flood pulse extent is well known to drive in a positive way the fishery. It's positively related to fish harvest. Here are some new hypotheses. The first is that variation, specifically variation between the high and low, is more important than the flood per se. The timing of the lows as well as the highs are equally important. And finally, the low flows are just as important as the highs. And so we're introducing kind of a set of new hypotheses for this flood pulse fishery and for others that we're going to analyze in a very rigorous quantitative framework that I'm going to show you in a little bit. Okay, so that gives you sort of that context, the science context now, and now we're going to dive into some results. So the first set of results are focused on hydrology and what's happened to the Mekong over the last century, with dams being built starting at 1964, right in the middle of that century scale analysis. And then we'll do the fisheries analysis and look at the effect of hydrology on fisheries and also our ability to forecast the fishery using hydrology as a driver. Okay, so how do we measure change? We're going to measure change using what's called a breakpoint regression. And the details of that are not important, but basically we're going to be looking for significant shifts in the trend of all the metrics that I just showed you in the previous slide: flood pulse extent, NAA, interflood interval, and some of those other metrics that I described for you in the previous slide. And what we're going to be looking for is a break somewhere between 1944 and 1964. 1964 is the closure of the first dam on a tributary in the Mekong Basin in Thailand. And the Fourier analysis requires 20 years of data, so 20 years before 1964 is 1944. So we would expect there to be a break sometime in that 20-year window if dams are indeed responsible for any changes that are observed in the hydrology. Okay? So let's look at some of that hydrology. First, we're going to look at what I call the high-level indicators of hydrology. This is flood pulse extent on the top, and this is the net annual anomaly on the bottom. And this is that period 1944 to 1964 in the gray rectangle here. And again, we expect to see a break in that rectangle if dams are at least partly responsible for the change observed. And so for flood pulse extent, we see a clear change, a shift downward, so a weaker flood pulse, and that flood pulse that change starts almost exactly at 1964. The interesting thing is that this breakpoint before the construction of dams is actually stronger than the one that's associated with the closure of that first dam. And I'm going to return to that in the context of climate change later. We did not see a significant effect of dam building on the net annual anomaly, but did see a strong effect of a strong shift prior to the closure of the first dam. And again, I'm going to come back to that in the context of climate change, but I want you to look at how the variability of this indicator of variability is changing around the time of the closure of the dam. It's clearly something is happening during this period, either driven by whatever's happening here or by dams. So what's going on with NAA? Let's look at now some of the other indicators that I talked about, and I call these components of NAA. So they're kind of shape features of the hydrograph that contribute to what we're measuring in NAA, and they give us a little bit more delicacy, a delicate ability to sort of quantify a fingerprint of change that might be associated with the construction and closure of the first dam in 1964. So if we look at these now, this is interflood interval on the top, this is the magnitude of high flow anomalies in the middle, and this is the number or frequency of high flow anomalies in the bottom. And so those are the three top indicators. They're the three that are most related to the fishery, which I'll come to later. All three of them have a significant breakpoint in this 1944 to 1964 period. It's a little earlier than that for flood pulse extent, but nonetheless, it falls right in this window of when dams started to be constructed in the Mekong Basin. And lo and behold, there's this this earlier breakpoint emerging, which is probably why we see such a strong breakpoint for this in NAA, and some other breakpoints which we think might be climate related. So we're going to look at climate next, but I just want to give you a feel for the take-home messages here. First, breakpoints for all of these indicators are consistent with altered variability within the first 3 to 12 years of the closure of that first dam in the Mekong system. So that means that even though that dam is way upstream and in a tributary, we can measure the change in terms of variability in the hydrograph. Downstream all the way at Stung Treng, which is in Cambodia, on the big river, downstream of all the major tributaries, we can still measure that signal. Okay, so what about climate change? Remember, one of the key observations about climate change is that there has been an ongoing increase in variability between wet and dry years, especially recently. That's almost exactly what we see in the NAA signal, right? We see NAA increasing over the century scale, and especially since 1964, and again, even more significantly since the early 90s. So let's now turn to the previous sets of data, our discharge, right? And if we're looking at discharge analysis and we're saying, oh, these indicators of variability in hydrology change almost exactly at the same time the first dam is closed. But it could be also that climate changed during that time as well, so we have to rule that out. So we're going to look at a long-term climate record with the same sort of breakpoint analysis to see where the breakpoints fall for climate. This is that analysis, and this is the Palmer Drought Severity Index, PDSI, which is and it's done at a basin scale for the entire Mekong, and then for the basin upstream of Stung Treng, where we have the gauge for the discharge in this bottom panel. PDSI gives us a nice indicator of a sort of basin scale climate, and these are annual estimates. They're reconstructed from tree rings. So one of our Finnish colleagues on the paper analyzed these, and we used them in this context. And so if climate is responsible for that shift in that breakpoint that we see in hydrologic variability in 1964 and in the 1960s, then we would expect there to be a climate breakpoint in that gray rectangle, and specifically at the year 1964, because these are actually the annual estimates. And we don't see that. Instead, we see strong climate signals right before that rectangle, which is consistent with our observation of breakpoints that are not dam-driven in the hydrologic indicators in the previous slide. We also see weaker but still significant shifts in increases in variability starting in the early 90s, and that continues to today. So we're seeing lots of variance, lots of variability. So take-home message is that climate is changing, but we can still, in the backdrop of that climate change, record an impact of closure of the first dam and continued closure of dams in the basin on the hydrologic variability. Okay. So now we're into the last piece, and I actually have there are 6 pieces here, but there's actually a 7th that I don't have in this outline. So I just wanted to give you that forewarning. Once we get through this, we have one more piece. So right now we're going to look at fisheries, the historical fishery, and we're going to ask, how does that hydrology relate to the historical fishery? What are the key hydrologic drivers of the fishery? And then in that 7th section that's not on this outline, we're going to use those drivers from the historical analysis to project and forecast the fishery and try to design or engineer hydrographs that are better for the fishery, that might be traded off with hydropower. Okay, so again, fisheries data comes from the Tonle Sap River on this commercial fishery, which is called the Dye. And the Dye is capturing the outflow of the Tonle Sap Lake after the flood pulse. So flood pulse goes in, and as it comes out, the Dye captures an enormous amount of fish. And so this is just a picture of the Dye. This is a picture actually of a really low haul at the end of the fishing season. I'm going to show you some other pictures. The haul during the peak season is enormous. This is just one example of a woman sorting on one of the Dyes a huge number of fish. And a lot of this fish stays in Cambodia and gets ground into a paste, which goes into many of the dishes, including a soup that's eaten by the locals. That's super important for food security and for nutrition, right? Because that fish with heads and eyeballs and brains in it has lots of vitamin A and lots of omegas in addition to protein. So big nutrition here. The haul is also diverse. This is one of my students, Joseph Hallway, showing off some of the other fish that might be caught in the Dye. This is a giant catfish, and so many interesting different types of fish in the basin. I'm only showing you 2 radically different ones, but many of the fish that I had as a kid in Aquaria are also captured in the Tonle Sap, not necessarily in the Dye, but in the lake itself. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the fisheries analysis, and we're going to use a fisheries analysis called MARS. What on earth is MARS? MARS is a time series method that is based on a set of analytical tools that have been used for economists for a long time to look at causes in various economic phenomena. We're going to use them in an ecological context and with hydrology as a driver. So this is what MARS is simplified. The acronym stands for Multivariate Autoregressive State Space Model. So I think there's MARSS, right? And basically what it is pretty simple. It's your modeling catch this year based on catch last year, plus some error, and plus this effect of hydrology this year. Okay, so we're going to compile those into this formula. And so that's the MAR part is just catch last year, catch this year is equal to some coefficient times catch last year. Okay, we add this component, which we get from the DFFT, and that's hydrologic variation. So we can put in NAA, we can put in flood pulse extent, we can put in IFI, we can put all of them in, and we're going to look at the effects of all of them in the next series of slides. The state space piece is in this error term, and the beauty of this model is that it allows us not only to look at random variation and to separate that from the effects of hydrology on catch, but it also allows us to differentiate between that random error and error that results from counting errors. So it's called observation error, and it's error that's inherent in a system with that many fish, and it's that busy that you're going to make mistakes counting fish. So we can account for that, and the fact that it allows us to do this actually allows us to have more robust estimates of hydrology. Okay, so these are the 2-part steps. Okay, the first is we're going to quantify historical effects of hydrology on catch, and this is going to tell us a lot about how the system works. It's also going to give us clues about what shapes in the hydrograph are important for the fishery, and that will be done by using those component drivers of hydrology, like interflood interval, like the maximum high flow, the magnitude of the high flow anomaly, like the frequency, etc. Step 2 is we're going to use historical drivers, which are estimated from step 1. And it could be future hydrology, or we could just invent future hydrology given the historical drivers to see what happens to the fishery. And that's exactly what we're going to do, is create future scenarios by using the historical drivers that we measure in step 1 and creating a set of hypothetical hydrographs. And then we'll plug that into the Mars model to see what that does to the fishery. So we're, instead of doing it in retroactively, we're doing it fast forward. Okay. Okay, so first let's look at the historical analysis. And we're going to look at this in 2 pieces. The first is what I call the high-level hydrologic drivers, which are flood pulse extent and the net annual anomaly. And these 2 drivers turn out to be super significant and important predictors of the fishery. The flood pulse extent has a strong positive effect on the fishery, which is exactly what we would have expected based on Wellcome's book and lots of analysis since Wellcome's book. But surprisingly, NAA, also a negative NAA, has a positive effect on the fishery, meaning that drought is also important. So not only is the flood important, but some metrics of low flow are also important. And this suggests that variability and the variation between highs and lows is important. And that, as we've seen in previous slides, is changing. So knowing how exactly this variability is affecting the fishery is important for understanding the management of the system in the future. You can ignore the density independent, dependent analyses. They gave more or less the same results, but with lower magnitude, still significant, the density dependent analysis. Density dependence just is the notion that the fish actually have a carrying capacity, or limited in their ability to grow based on the resource base in the system. And frankly, I think that at the time that we did this analysis, there weren't enough data to really analyze density dependence. So it's something that we should consider in the future, but we don't have a lot of confidence in yet. But I do have a lot of confidence in this density independent result, and I can say that the two analyses don't give different qualitative results. Okay, so that was the high level analysis. Now let's unpack NAA into its components. And there are 8 of those components, and I'm not going to go into gory detail about all of them, because there are really only 3 that are really important in that we're going to use to imagine an ideal shape of the hydrograph of the fishery. Okay, and so this again is effect size, so it's the strength of the effect of these different indices of hydrologic variability. This is interflood interval on the left. This is the magnitude of the high flow anomaly, the second one, and the third one is the frequency of those high flows, so how many storm pulses you get during the flood pulse. All 3 of those are significant and have positive effects on the fishery. So even the drought, the interflood interval, the number of days between high flow peaks, has a significant positive effect on the fishery. And that is commensurate with or greater than the effect of some of these high flow metrics of variance. And so the takeaways from this slide are that low flows actually have the strongest positive effect on the size of the fishery, which is a big surprise. And it offers a lot of insight about how variability actually works in the context of the fishery. And the second is that, as we expected, the peak magnitude and the number of events of the flood pulse are important, and they have positive effects on the fishery as well. Okay, so that's the historical analysis. We know flood pulse extent is important, but we also know that negative NAA is a positive influence on the fishery. We also know that these component drivers, their flood interval and the magnitude of the flood pulse are important. So let's use some of this as insight to design a hydrograph that might maximize fishery yield. So I think I'm going to skip this slide and come back to it, because I have a second set of conclusions at the end of the next section. I more or less just went over these conclusions in the last slide. Low flows are important, and we're going to come back to that. Okay. So the title of this paper, which I also had in the title slide of this talk, it has the word design in it, which implies a level of geoengineering. And that's kind of exactly what we're going to do in the next segment, is we're going to say, given the science, given the Mars results, the Mars DFFT results, can we use those drivers to imagine a hydrograph that has a shape that actually either sustains the fishery or might improve it? And then we put that design flow to the dam operators and say, hey, how do we optimize this with hydropower? And that's another step that's at least a year down the road that we're working on currently with NSF funding. But right now we're going to just look at the shape and see if we can create some shapes that make sense for the fishery. Okay, and I'm not going to make you memorize this. I'm not going to test you on this. I just put this here because the algorithm that we use to create the shapes of these hydrographs is not pulled from thin air. It's actually a Fourier series. So we use the Fourier transformation to analyze hydrology and connect it to the fishery through Mars. We can also use Fourier series to invent signals that look like hydrographs that might have nice impacts on the fishery. And this one, which is an asymmetric rectangular pulse wave, is the one that we're after. It has a long drought, that's this bottom base, and then it shoots up to a peak that hopefully is bigger than what's expected from the seasonal norm. So we need to create that signal, and that's done basically with this piece of that formula. Okay. And here's some examples, and this is just a thought exercise that we went through in order to test to see whether this works, right? Because if this works, then a dam operator on a daily basis could create a signal like this and manage dam releases to match not necessarily one of these designs, but a design like this that still provides safety downstream and enough power to make the dams pay back themselves. Okay, so these are the three designs that we looked at. The first is historical, and this is just a recreated historical year. And we had historical data dating back to 1900 to draw from, between 1900 and 1964. This is the long-term seasonal signal underneath in red. So you can see that the historical flows nicely fall on that natural line. And so, and then the second two are engineered hydrographs. The first is a good design. It has a long IFI, interflood interval, followed by a big peak, which is the flood pulse. And it has a number of peaks along that sustained flood pulse. And then finally, the bad design has actually positive anomalies during the low flow season, which is bad, and negative anomalies during the high flow season, so a weak flood pulse, and that's bad as well. So we've got historical, good, and bad, and basically what we're asking is, well, hey, there are dams in the system. They're probably not going to get removed anytime soon, in a lifetime or ever. Therefore, we're never going to have this again. Can we, but this, we know this is good. Can we create hydrographs that give us the same result as historical flows in terms of fish production? Okay, so we use those flows, estimate their hydrologic metrics, put them into the Mars model, forward project the Mars model to get the fishery. We do that kind of in a Monte Carlo framework, so we do it thousands of times, and then we get a distribution of the results. That's what this figure is right here. Okay, so this figure shows you what happens for the good scenario, the bad scenario. This is the current fishery and its projection, and this would be if we could recreate the historical flows, the pre-dam flows. And so I'll start with current. Current stays, if we look at this middle orange line, which is the median, stays almost the same, almost no change, a little bit of positive change, and that might be because over the last 10 years, we've seen so much increase in the variability in the system, which is actually good for the fishery. Pre-dam, we get an increase, but that increase isn't significant. It would need to have over 8 years into the future a 5% confidence limit, which is this red line above the blue line, indicating that in the worst case, it increased. The good design, by contrast, increases, and it increases significantly. And by, I can't remember the exact number, but between 2 and 3 times that of the pre-dam or historical flow. And just to kind of have a pulse check on this process, the bad design is indeed bad. It creates a fishery that crashes and that declines significantly in 8 years. And so with this thought exercise now, we know we can create and engineer hydrographs that do things likely to the fishery that might be interesting for management of the system. None of this has been tried in the real world, and it needs a lot more QA/QC before it could be implemented. But it does suggest that we have a tool, a new tool in the toolkit, and that is we now know that this design or some version of it is good for the fishery, and we can use that design in combination for one that's good for hydropower production and one that's good for flood protection, and say, in what ways can we find solution spaces between those three potential extremes where we're not only cooking energy, but we're providing flood control and we're managing the fishery in a responsible way. It may not be increasing the fishery, but managing it for food outcomes, let's say. Okay, so I'm gonna pivot now again to some conclusions and talk a little bit about the MRC again. The MRC for many decades has been sort of the authority for planning in the region and for planning of sustainable development. So any dam that has to get built has to go through a review process called prior consultation by the MRC. And so let's talk about these designs in the context of the role of the MRC. But first, I just want to do a quick reality check on the design flows. Is it possible to do designs? We did an analysis to ask and answer that question. And what we did is we said, okay, given that this is what the flood pulse looks like, this is what the design flow looks like, this water in the shaded area is how much water we need in order to, and we need to store in reservoirs in order to deliver it later during the flood pulse in order to balance and improve the fishery. And then we asked, is there that much water in any of these three sets of dams? So first we asked, is there that much water in the upstream cascade in China? Second, we asked, is there that much water in the tributaries in the Lao, in the Lao tributaries, which actually have some big storage reservoirs? These are Lao and Thailand. And then finally, for the 3S system, 3S is Sripak, Sesan, and Sekong, which are three rivers that come together at Stung Treng, where we measured discharge. And there's going to be an enormous amount of development of dams in this region. And so we asked, does that region have enough? So the gray is how much water you would need in cubic kilometers in order to deliver that flood pulse for the entire year. And then these bars are potential supplies in the upstream reservoirs in China, in the tributary dam and dams and reservoirs in Laos, and then in the 3S. All three have enough storage capacity to deliver that flood pulse. And that's not to say that you would want to use all the water in one of those locations to deliver that flood pulse, but it does suggest that there's enough water, and importantly, that there needs to be some coordination among these areas to deliver that flood pulse. And I'm going to come back to that in my final comments. Last thing that I want to talk about is that when this paper was published, since then there actually have been quite a few more dams built, and these are some data from Stimson Center that show those dams. There are actually 11 in the upper cascade in China now, 2 in Laos. And if we look at the impacts of those main stem dams on hydrologic connectivity between the mouth of the river and the upstream area, which is relevant to migratory fish, we can see that the dams that have been built upstream have diminished that connectivity incrementally, but in small amounts. Big effects of lower dams. So this one is Severity, and then some of these other dams down here would have enormous effects on connectivity of the basin, especially those that are built downstream. So the upshot of this graph is as we think about the planning of dams in the basin, the ones that are built downstream of the ones that are already built are going to have much more catastrophic effects than the ones that are built upstream. Okay, tributary dams, big part of this equation, and a lot of the focus sort of against dams and development of the basin has been on the main stem dams, but there's just as much pressure on tributaries and their development. This is a map of the 3S system, so Shui Kong, Say San, and Shui Pak. And this is Lower Say San 2 Dam, which is located right here at the confluence of Say San and Shui Pak. And this is one of my postdocs in the control command center for this dam, which is a very sophisticated, this dam is owned by a Chinese company in Cambodia. And this system is super sophisticated and suggests to me that some of the algorithms that we were talking about yesterday could in fact be implemented if they make sense in a system that's this sophisticated. And so the link that I want to make here is that engineering and design of hydrographs is important because, and it's important to be done in the spectral framework because it speaks in the language of the engineers that are actually operating the dams. Okay, so 3 more slides, path forward. Science diplomacy, transboundary data sharing is a huge essential ingredient to sustainable management of the system. First, we need better data from China, and in the case where we don't get better data from China, remote sensing and modeling of operations of Chinese facilities is becoming to be more and more possible, and that may allow us to understand at least the bounds on Chinese operations and allow us to prepare the lower basin, not just for floods, but for shortage like we saw last year, and also for management of the system over decadal scales. And then finally, even more important than getting those data from China, the first step is sharing of data within the lower basin countries to build trust and to build resilience and mitigation strategies. And these all would feed into some sort of an operations platform. And I'm going to get to sort of the owner of that platform, but somebody needs to manage that system. And we'll come back to that in the next slide. So second point, 3S is an enormously important system, developed or undeveloped. In an undeveloped sense, it provides natural flow, but we already have Lower Say San 2, which blocks 2 of the biggest tributaries on that system at the mouth. So in lieu of having natural systems and natural rivers or naturally flowing rivers in the 3S, the storage reservoirs that are being built in those could be used as a tool for managing the system more sustainably, ironically. And the key to that is collaboration with Chinese companies and other companies that are not from the lower basin that operate dams in the basin based on service contracts that were developed before fisheries was even thought of. As we start to build more dams, we need to think about those rule curves for fish in the context of some of these contracts. Okay, the last piece is that the MRC for many decades has been the planning agency for the Mekong. Now we have we have 2 main stem dams in the lower Mekong basin and 3 more that are approved. As development proceeds, MRC likely and hopefully will transition from a planning agency to an operations or a planning and operations agency. These tributary dams could store water necessary for design flows, and I think that's the operations capacity of the MRC. And importantly, because those tributaries are only in the lower basin, they offer a tool that's independent of what happens in China to manage the lower basin. And finally, I think a lot of care and science has to go into siting placement of the next structures, especially in the tributaries for the sustainability of the fishery. Okay, and with that, happy to take questions and discuss with Jerry.
All right, John, well, you've given us an awful lot of information. Let me see how much of it I got right. First of all, the Mekong is an important transboundary river. It 6 nations flows through 6 nations. It's an important source of food, both fish and rice, for tens of millions of people. And we have much of the tools and the knowledge to manage the hydrograph. And the implementing those is a different challenge. So you've shown that the river flow is being altered by climate change, and also it's alterable by dams. And at least over the next few decades, we won't have much of an effect on climate change, but we could have an effect on dams. What happens downstream is to a large extent controllable by what is done upstream. You can mitigate that, as you've pointed out, by building dams along some of the tributaries of the lower main stem of the Mekong. So, and we, as you said, we can design the hydrograph. So we can design the river flow and how it changes over time so that it would be good for fisheries, and I assume that also means it would be good for rice. One question I keep asking myself is, in most of the world where we have these important transboundary rivers, there are no written agreements among the nations as to how they shall cooperate to be sure that there is appropriate and fair sharing of water. Are there written agreements among these 6 nations as to how the water will be shared going forward?
It's a great question, and I've been asked it before. There is a compact between the lower Mekong Basin countries, and that compact is always called on when thinking about development and also sharing of data. There isn't one between upper and lower countries, and I think that's the critical piece. And there are examples of treaties, for example, that are transboundary that work. Not necessarily, they could work better, but there are examples of them in multinational settings.
So if in the absence then of any kind of compact with the upper countries, and particularly with China, then it seems to me what your comments about doing things on some of the tributaries to the lower Mekong take on added importance to ensure resilience. Would you agree?
Completely. And I think, in the absence of that formal treaty, then there are other means to approach the problem. One is through science. I mean, the borders aren't closed to scientists, and that's a role that I find fulfilling in this context. And another is collaboration with the companies that are operating the dams, because in many cases the operator is not as tightly regulated as you would think, and so building trust with especially the operators of dams that are coming online, and especially getting involved with the prior consultation process of new dams that are going to be built is an important step as well.
And in many respects, China is not going out of their way to make friends with a lot of their neighbors in the region. What about it in this area? Are they going out of their way to be a good neighbor to the countries downstream?
What's the question again? Say that again.
Well, if you look, a lot of the neighbors of China are being offended and being alienated. Japan, Australia. You look around the region and what's happening in the South China Sea. Are they going out of their way to antagonize some of these lower countries, or are they just ignoring them?
I would hazard that ignoring is a better way to.
It's more politically acceptable.
I don't think it's antagonism at all. I think it's that China has clear objectives. Whether they're to cook as much energy as possible, or whether it's to cook energy in order to pipe Mekong water over to the North-South Diversion Project, we don't know. But I don't think they're choosing specific times to create controversy. I think they're just going about their business.
So most of these dams are what are called run-of-the-river dams, designed primarily to generate electricity, but they still can have a significant impact on the hydrograph. Say a word about that, please.
Well, and that's the reason I brought the tributaries into play. So many of the dams, especially on the lower river, this is not true for the upper Cascade in China at all. Those main stem dams have significant storage to the tune of what's stored in Lake Mead and Lake Powell combined. But in the lower river, especially the dams that have been in WOW PDR and those that are on slate to be built in WOW PDR and proposed in Cambodia, store very little water. They're storing at most a month, but probably much less than that of the river's volume, probably on the order of days to a week. And therefore, you can't use those dams in this context to design flows. That's exactly why I brought the tributaries into play, right. Because there actually are already very large storage dams in Laos and in Thailand, and large ones proposed in the 3S system in Vietnam. And again, that kind of, if those dams are going to be built anyway, they could be used in this context to provide some resilience, right? When China doesn't send enough water down in the low flow season, and you know about it ahead of time, you can plan by tuning operations of dams downstream to compensate for that. But right now, there isn't a system in place that allows the lower basin to do that. And that, I think, should be the objective of the basin, to develop that platform.
And given all of the uncertainty within the region in terms of the agreements among countries as well as climate change, it seems like that would be a good move. And because, as you say, we have the knowledge that would allow us to develop these tools to increase the resilience of this region to the vagaries of nature and human beings.
That's right.
Any last word, John? This has been a fascinating lecture. I think this is a terribly important part of the world for all kinds of reasons, and what happens here, I think, will have many, many lessons, and the work that you and your colleagues are doing is critically important.
Thank you. And I would just say visit the region if you can. It's a beautiful region with developing tourism, trade, and infrastructure. And, I have grown up studying fisheries in the context of salmon, especially in the Columbia River in California. And salmon, as tasty as they are and as beautiful as they are not a vital component of food security in the United States. And to see a food system that depends on freshwater fisheries will just change your worldview as soon as you see it. So please go see it.
And Vietnam and that region is tending to rely more on aquaculture. Is that not correct?
That's true. And as we see low flows being tuned down upstream in China, we get increasing saltwater intrusion in the delta down there. And I think Vietnam is very keenly shifting from rice production to shrimp production down there because of the resilience of that industry to more saline water.
John, thank you for a fascinating lecture. I hope you'll come over and visit us sometime, because the theme of our new wing is food, energy, water. And we'd love to have you come and give us some advice. Thank you again.
I can't wait for having me.
And we hope those of you who are watching will join us next week. Charles Colgan is going to talk about the blue economy, and this is a very important lecture. The U.S. is largely sitting on the shore while the rest of the world is getting involved in the blue economy. Come and hear Charles and get his advice on what we need to do. Thank you all, and John, thank you again for a great lecture.
You're welcome. Thank you.